In this session, we are talking about equitable evaluation practices, a subject that whether we are grantees or grant makers, I think many of us grapple through and continue to try to make shifts. In our own space, our EVP of impact reminds us that measurement is a necessary but fragile thing. We'll talk a little bit more about that toward the end of this session, but to guide this discussion, to guide our time together, we are thrilled to have Claire Robertson-Kraft. And Claire, unmute for a second and help me make sure that I am pronouncing your name and your organization properly, because I know you. I just know you as Claire all the time, but I want to honor both your name and your organization.
Yes, thanks, Uva, for having us here today. Claire Robertson-Kraft. People can call me CRK because I know the last name is a mouthful sometimes, and I'm from Impact Ed.
Wonderful. Thank you, Claire. Honoring people's names, we try our best to do so. And so we wanted to make sure that we could also honor this topic by bringing in people who are, I think, practitioners who we can learn from. So Claire has done a remarkable job of assembling an incredible roster of practitioners who are leading voices in this space. They are researching, they are applying, they are adjusting and sharing learnings with us and with the rest of the field. Claire is going to introduce us to each of our speakers, beginning with Daria, George, and a good colleague, Candace Kenyatta, whose leadership lens I know and admire deeply. This is really a great group, and we are thankful that Claire has brought them into this space for mutual learning. Claire's bio will be in the chat a little bit later on. If it's not there already, again, toggling between screens. So I'm hopeful that it's there. If not, it will be there soon. You can learn more about her by reading her bio. And I'm going to ask Claire to introduce everyone else, but by way of small introduction for her, I will say that I've known her for quite some time in our work here at Spring Point Partners with Ember, one of our priority areas, but also well beyond. And I know Claire to be a thoughtful, data-driven person who excels at distilling data into these accessible, digestible stories. And that's why we are here today, but we're going to ground this in equity. I'm going to turn it over to Claire, and we'll return at the end of our session with closing remarks. But first, and again, a reminder that this will be a dynamic session with interactive breakouts where your voice will be lifted. So if you can, I know we're all doing a number of things, so please turn us on, join us on camera if you're able to. If not, we'll work around it. And final reminder, again, today's session will be recorded, but breakout rooms will not be, allowing you, I hope, some degree of comfort and intimacy and community building and confidentiality. With all of that, a huge, huge thank you to all of you who are here today. And I'll turn it over to Claire. Claire, this session is all yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Uva, and the Spring Point team for having us here today. As Uva shared, my name is Claire Robertson-Kraft. The last name can be a bit of a mouthful, so CRK is what a lot of people call me. And I'm the founder and executive director of Impact Ed. For those of you that aren't familiar with Impact Ed, we're a center based out of the University of Pennsylvania that helps mission-driven organizations use evaluation and learning to accelerate social impact. And it's great to see a lot of familiar names on this Zoom list here today, this afternoon, and also some new names. Really excited to get an opportunity to connect with all of you. As Uva shared, I am joined today by a group of amazing colleagues. We all actually work together as part of an initiative called the Pew Fund Evaluation Capacity Building Initiative, or ECBI for short. I know some folks on the Zoom are familiar with ECBI, but for those of you that aren't, it was launched in 2018 by the Pew Fund in partnership with Impact Ed, where I work, McClanahan Associates, and GLE, who you'll get a chance to hear more from today. And the goal of this collective work is to strengthen organizations' abilities to evaluate their programs, but more so than that, to really use data to respond to the needs and goals of the individuals and communities that they served. So we are served. So we are thrilled today to be joined by two of those organizations, Compass Working Capital and Healing Hurt People. And I'm actually going to ask my colleague, Jocelyn Hastings, who's joining us here today as well, if she could put in the chat a handout that we have that goes into much more detail than I'll have time to today on the amazing work that both Compass Working Capital and Healing Hurt People do. So if you're interested in learning more. So as part of our collective work together, we've been piloting an approach for thinking about how to employ equitable evaluation practices, as Uva mentioned. And we know that for lots of people, like equitable evaluation can sound like a really theoretical concept. And so our goal today, as the title of the session suggests, is to demystify equitable evaluation and share with you some concrete strategies and ideas for how you can employ equitable evaluation in your organizations. I will say that we're drawing a lot of our work from the Equitable Evaluation Initiative. There's also a link to that, as well as some other resources in the handout if you're interested in going deeper. And we are very much still on our own learning journey ourselves about equitable evaluation. And so we are eagerly excited to learn from and hear from all of you today about what you're doing in your work as well. So with that, I wanted to share my screen. And we are going to get into talking a little bit more about how we're going to structure the time today to accomplish those goals. So as I shared, our goal today is to make sure that you leave here with some knowledge and strategies related to equitable evaluation. You're going to get to hear from some amazing organizations that we've had an opportunity to work from a little bit later. We also want to provide you with an opportunity to connect and learn from each other, because you all are bringing such expertise into this space as well. So we're eager to hear what you're trying, what you're wrestling with, what you're thinking about. And finally, we hope you leave here inspired. We're all really inspired, as you'll hopefully hear from us today, about the importance of equitable evaluation work. And so we hope you leave here feeling that way as well, and being able to take something back to your practice. For those of you that like a good roadmap, I happen to be one of those people. Just wanted to give you a sense of how we're going to spend our time here together. We're going to do a short discussion to start about what is equitable evaluation. Again, it's a term that gets thrown around sometimes without really taking time to define what it means. So we wanted to start with that. Then we're going to have a panel conversation where you'll get to hear from the amazing colleagues that I mentioned more about their experiences and practices that they've put into place within their organizations. Then we're going to do some small group breakouts where you're going to get a chance to process some of what is coming up in the conversation and also share your own practices and learnings with peers. And then we'll do a short wrap up where we synthesize some of the takeaways and talk about what's next. So that's our plan. Before we get into talking about equitable evaluation, though, we just wanted to spend a moment thinking about traditional evaluation practices. And so Uva mentioned this was going to be interactive. We're going to keep it interactive. And we wanted to give you all a chance to let us know, right? Like, what is it that comes to mind when you hear or you think about traditional or historical approaches to evaluation? So I'm going to ask you to put in a chat. It could be a word or a phrase that, comes to mind for you. People jumped right in. Love it. And I'm recognizing some of these names. Good to see some familiar folks here. Impersonal, extractive, accountability, exploitative, academic, clinical ones. These are right on point. Could I invite a few people to come off mute? I might start with someone that I know. So watch out if I know somebody here to kick off the conversation. But Andy, impersonal, do you want to chime in and share a little bit more? Andy's had an opportunity to work with him in the past. So I'm going to see if you'd want to share a little more about what you mean by impersonal.
Sure. Yeah, I had a feeling it was going to be me you'd call on. Claire, thanks for this, and thanks for those hosting this. I would say the opposite of human-centered. So I'm thinking more of like from a systems perspective as opposed to being human-centered.
Awesome. Thanks, Andy. Anyone else want to pop off mute? I'd love to hear from maybe one or two more people, either a word you put in the chat or something that you see somebody else puts in that really kind of resonates with you around traditional evaluation practices.
I think we often evaluate what we can measure easily instead of thinking about what is important to measure.
Yeah, love that. Thanks, Simon. Right. And I saw some nods. And I see some of that reflected in the chat as well, right? It's like the easy thing to measure versus the thing that actually matters most to the individuals and communities that you're working with. How about one more? Again, it could be the word you put in the chat or potentially one that really stands out for you that you see from somebody else. How about someone that put extractive or exploitative, those words? Like, tell us more what you had in mind there. Go ahead, Sloan.
Yeah, I wrote extractive, and this is funny. This actually just came up in a focus group last week, where for me that has looked like basically the data gets collected and it never goes back to the community, right? There's never any real action put back to the community with the data that's collected. So that's what I meant by extractive.
Yep. And again, I saw some nods with that, right? It's like taking, right, and using in some way and not actually engaging on the front end or even looping back with communities on the back end to share what was learned. Great. Lots of good words in here. Not good words actually, but right on point words, right? Words that are, I think, why people have such distrust often of evaluation and the work that they do. So that's traditionally what we think of when we think of evaluation practices. I want to talk a little bit about what we mean then when we're talking about shifting to a more equitable lens for evaluation. And I started my career as a classroom teacher, which I actually know a couple of other folks on this call, I imagine probably did as well. Simon talking about the things that are easy to measure. I feel like that was often the case in education and the experience that I had in the classroom. And that was in addition to being things that were easy to measure, it was that evaluation was often focused on accountability, right? Evaluation was for someone else. It was for, the principal or the school or the district to prove your worth, right? And that focus on accountability was often not focused in centering the work that you were doing around mission and purpose. And so we talk about equitable evaluation, we're thinking about how do we think about evaluation in a way that is really responding to the mission, the purpose, the ultimate outcomes that organizations are working towards. So I started my career as a classroom teacher. After I was a classroom teacher, I worked in the nonprofit space for a number of years. And what I felt like evaluation was during the time when I was in the nonprofit space was very focused on a culture of compliance, right? Again, evaluation was done for somebody else, for a government agency, for a funder, versus being done for the people within the organization to create a culture of reflection, learning, and growth. So when we talk about equitable evaluation, we're talking about how evaluation and data can be used to facilitate that type of learning and growth, not as just a form of compliance. And then finally, after I was a classroom teacher and then I worked in the nonprofit sector, I went back to grad school because I wanted to learn more about evaluation. And the message that I got, and if any of you all have ever taken a class or been formally trained in evaluation, the message that you often get is that there's a single objective measure, right, of truth, of rigor, of prioritizing certain types of methods over others. When the reality is that, and I don't have to tell anybody on this conversation this, because I know you all are deeply aware of it, that the work is very complex, right? And it's not about a single perspective. It's not about one way of knowing or understanding something. It's really about valuing the complexity of multiple perspectives. And so we're talking about shifting from traditional to equitable evaluation practices. These are some of the shifts that we're talking about. But underlying all of it is a shift from a more focus on the technical aspects of evaluation to the relational aspects. And so these things were already coming up. And I think a lot of the words that you all were reflecting is that evaluation traditionally has been thought of as objective, right? The evaluator is the expert. They have all of the answers, right? Versus in a more relational approach, equitable evaluation is leaning into not knowing. It's about humility. It's about recognizing that the communities that are being served are ultimately the experts in their work, right? Not the evaluator. And moving from an extractive, that word came up a number of times in the chat, where you're taking, right, from the community and not circling back, to really engaging communities in all steps of the process. So I know when I started my work in evaluation, we did what you see on the left-hand side here was a lot more of the emphasis, and it never felt like a real partnership or engagement. So we're talking about equitable evaluation is really thinking about ways to engage community in each step of the process and circle back with them to share what was learned. And then finally, that requires a move from leading with methods to really thinking about leading with values. What are some of the things that are required of people engaged in evaluation work to build those strong relationships, to understand what you don't know, to be open to learning and growth and really challenging yourself? And so this, again, is this move from technical to relational and traditional to equitable evaluation. So this is what we mean when we say equitable evaluation. This is how we're defining equitable evaluation. The handout that was put in the chat that Jocelyn shared has more information on the equitable evaluation initiative. So we're drawing these definitions from them. But I think it's important to think about equity and evaluation as both an ends and a means. So in terms of the ends, it's what you're working towards, right? What is the ultimate outcome or mission? And how do you think about evaluation in service of achieving that mission and working towards equity, as well as equity as a means? So how do you think about how the actual process through which you engage people in evaluation work? So that can look a lot of different kinds of ways, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that as well. So next question we have for you, I want to give you a minute to look and think about this shift that we've just talked about. And now I want you to put a different set of words in the chat. I want you to put words that come to mind when you think about, when you look at this definition of equitable evaluation and you think about those shifts that I just described, like what words come to mind now? And hopefully they are different than some of the words that we had before. That's the shift we're trying to make. What words come to mind? Inquisitive, trust, ongoing. Love it. I love the focus on flexible, right? Not just one way, one objective way to do something in evaluation, but being flexible and responsive to the needs. Better, but harder. That's coming from someone that sounds like they've definitely engaged in equitable evaluation practices. Looking forward to hearing a little bit more about that. All right, I'd love to invite maybe two people again to come off mute. Is there a word that you put in the chat that you think of when you think of equitable evaluation practices and how it might be different? Or maybe a word that you see somebody else put in the chat. I see trust got a couple of hearts. So Erica, I don't know if I can invite you into the conversation to share what came to mind for you when you put trust in.
Sure. I just think about trust in the process, right? Lots of times when we talk about evaluation, it's always that top-down layer to it. So it's really being in the space to trust the process and not to take it personal, just really be in the moment of what it is that needs to be evaluated, because ultimately we want there to be growth. So in order for things to grow, we just have to trust the process.
I love that. Erica, you might not have known that that's actually one of our favorite phrases to use when we talk about this work is trust the process, not just a good sports reference for Philadelphia, but it's also, I think, really apt. And so I appreciate you sharing. It is a process. It is hard, right? This kind of shift that we're talking about to really building meaningful relationships. It takes time, it takes effort. So appreciate you sharing that. It looks like co-learning also got a couple of hearts. I don't know, Amber, if you want to share a little more about what came to mind when you were thinking about co-learning.
Yeah, sure. I think when I'm considering an equitable evaluation, it's less about coming in as the expert, yourself as the evaluator, and really kind of viewing the whole process as something as, the community and the program, whatever it is you're working at, they have expertise on their lives. And so you're like learning from one another throughout the process.
Yeah, I love that. Absolutely. Yeah. I know when I started my work in evaluation, people would expect that the evaluator has the answers. They are the expert. Yeah. The exact opposite, right? It's the community has the expertise. And as someone that's engaged in evaluation work, you're deeply learning alongside them, challenging some of your own assumptions as part of that process. Appreciate that. Anybody else want to share a word or phrase that comes to mind about the shift from traditional to equitable evaluation? Okay, well, this is a great start to this. It's clear that as we expected, there's some folks that are in the session right now that I imagine from just your comments and what you're putting in the chat, you have a lot of expertise to share as well. So we are really eager to dig in, to share some of our ideas, to hear from all of you about what you're trying and working on with equitable evaluation. So with that, I'm going to pitch it over to my co-conspirator, my colleague, Candace Kenyatta from GLE, who is going to talk a little bit more about the approach to equitable evaluation that we've taken as part of our work together and kick off our panel conversation. So Candace, over to you.
Thank you very much, Claire. So I just want to echo what Claire shared. I think the comments and the words that you shared in your reflections on what equitable evaluation means or what's coming to mind as you think about the first half of this presentation are really aligned with some of the conversations we were having as we were starting to put together this equitable evaluation approach that we've been piloting through the ECDI. So I want to talk a little bit about that in more detail. And then we'll go into our panel discussion to dig more deeply into practices that our colleagues from Compass Working Capital and Healing Hurt People have used in their work. So this is the approach, and as Claire mentioned earlier, we are still on our journey, and part of being on that journey is that this approach in its visual format does not necessarily represent all of the connectivity between these elements that I'll go through with you. So what we decided on, and even the visual representation, because of how much these pieces really collide and come together and inform each other, to just kind of anchor them as tenets of an equitable evaluation approach grounded in what we call the 4 Ps. And the 4 Ps for us are people, purpose, process, and practice. And there are lots of interconnections that I think you'll see as I walk you through the approach. So in the people and purpose layer of our equitable evaluation approach lives organizational mission, learning culture, and community engagement. And those 3 components address 3 major parts of what your evaluation is grounded in, your why, your values. So in organizational mission, it is how do you align the outcomes and the impacts of your work to what your community needs? How are you thinking about this work in a way that is human-centered and really responsive to the community? In learning culture, it reflects thinking about the mindsets, capacities, practices, systems that are needed, both internally within your organization and also in how your organization engages community in order to effectively demonstrate or implement equitable evaluation activities. And then finally, community engagement, which is about ensuring that the work is done not to the community, but with the community. I know that in the first set of words, we saw impersonal, extractive, limited, and so much of the top row of this approach is really about disrupting some of those words that you used earlier that were non-human centric and that were not grounded in values. And much like Claire, I began my career as a high school English teacher. And when I started my journey as a researcher, I came into the work as learning ethnography first, which I think is why this first row really resonates with me, and the concept of community as expert and not researcher as expert in that way, because I think that is what is at the core of ethnography is what does it mean to respect the expertise in a community and really make yourself present to learn from and learn with and engage community in a really authentic way. The bottom row is focused on process and practice, and it probably looks fairly familiar to those of you who have engaged evaluation as a part of your own practice. It is what are kind of the nuts and bolts of building an evaluation strategy. So defining and measuring the things that matter most. And again, linked very closely with what are your organization's values, what is the mission of your work, and how is community at the center of defining that strategy. Data collection and analysis, which is about the process used to collect and make sense of data, again, informed by your organization's values, the mission of your work, and community voice. And then finally, data use, which is about how data is shared, how data is then leveraged and turned around to create impact and change. I heard someone earlier say, often data is collected and it never makes its way back to community. And I assume that means, or, also hinted at, not just back to community to say, hey, here's what you said, but also back to the community to say, here's how we're going to make some community aligned shifts that are responsive to the things that we learned. And so that's really what the data use component of the approach refers to. So now that we've talked a little bit about the 4 Ps, I really want to dig into a conversation with Daria and George about their experiences executing against these 4 Ps in their own practice. I wish I could do them justice and give them an intro, but I'm going to ask them to do those things themselves. But I will say I have the pleasure of being both Compass's and HHP's ECBI coach. So I'm very biased about both Daria and George's work, and think that there's so much to learn from them. I'm consistently learning from them. So to kick us off, I would love to hear the 2 of you share a little bit about how you've thought about aligning your evaluation work to your organization's mission. And if you could, before you jump into that question, just give us a little bit of an intro about you and your organization.
Yeah, I can start. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daria Waite. I am a research associate with Drexel University's Center for Nonviolence and Social Justice. Just a little bit of background. You may be familiar, but there are a series of programs that are operated through Drexel Center, one of them being Healing Her People, which is our hospital and community-based violence intervention program. But we also have some prevention efforts that have launched in recent years. And we also have a training academy in which we train and certify young people between the ages of like 18 and 24 to become specialists, peer specialists, and engage in healing work and violence intervention and prevention efforts throughout the city on their own, and create a career pathway, through that trajectory. So that's a little bit about the center. And in terms of aligning that with our research endeavors, that's interesting. I have the pleasure, like Candace said, of working with Candace and strengthening that alignment. But for me, what that means is remembering that we as a center were designed to develop and to promote and endorse trauma-informed, culturally responsive, human-centered practices that are supportive of not only the individual needs, but collective community needs that address the harms that have been done on broader scales. So what that means is that we need to be moving with the perspective and with the insights and the feedback of community members. I don't want to go too deeply into how I define community. It's going to come out a little bit later on. But yes, we really do ground ourselves in making sure that we shift and evolve in ways that are very much informed by those who we support, as well as our staff and their experiences supporting communities.
Thank you, Daria. George.
Hi, everybody. So my name is George. I'm the Director of Impact and Innovation at Compass Working Capital. Briefly, Compass is a nonprofit financial services organization that is working to end asset poverty in this country and narrow the racial and gender wealth gaps. Scroll up and click on the handout before if you want to learn more. My role at Compass is to think about how we collect information and then use that information to deliver better services. So fairly wide-reaching. And I do just want to also honor like the expertise in this room. Like this is definitely one of those situations where the panelists are not the experts and the other participants in the webinar are not. So just really welcome joining you all in conversation on this topic. I think at its heart, what we see, what I see as creating alignment is a recognition that we are committed to talking with the folks we serve and responding to what they're telling us, and doing that frankly and honestly and repeatedly and relentlessly, so that we have a path forward to actually delivering better services. Like this is the way for us to actually make our programs stronger, deliver to stronger and at scale is by listening to what our clients are telling us and following their lead, really. And so I think that message probably won't be new to the folks in this room based on what I'm hearing. I'll say a little bit more that I think sometimes what we can get trapped in, at least those of us with sort of an evaluation bent, is getting through just setting up our systems. Like, what's the survey that we need? What's our interview protocol? What's our focus group? And we can spend so much time sort of at the front end thinking through that we miss the opportunity to invest our resources in understanding what we've collected and then using that information to deliver better services. And so a couple of like techniques that I think we have had some success with are, we founded a client advisory board about 6 years ago, which we really saw as a core component of how we will make decisions at the organization. It has since turned into a board committee, so it has governance responsibility, and it's composed of folks who are enrolled in our programs or have graduated from our programs. Our CEO is the core person who is attending that from the staff, is at every client advisory board or now program committee meeting. And I think that centers and honors the expertise of our clients in a way that maybe some of our other methods have not always. And so I think that is one approach that works well. I think another way we do it that has worked well is my team doesn't like do a bunch of interviews or do a data collection process and then like present a report back to an executive team or something like that, and then they carry with it. We really try to facilitate a conversation with what our clients are telling us, and really push the team to be grounding the next things that they want to work on the things that we're hearing through our various collection methods, and directly engaging them in that conversation. So those are a couple of ways that we try to continue to align our evaluation efforts with our mission.
George, I love the detail and specificity you gave there on practices that you use. Daria, I'm curious if there are some things that that HHP does that you want to elevate around just ensuring that community voice. And I know you define community very broadly. We talked about that. And so would love to hear you share a little bit more about that work.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to. I didn't want to get into it too soon, but let's do it now, right?
George took us there. I'm like, let's go.
Yes, so a couple of things that came to mind as Claire and Candace were talking earlier. What really resonated with me is the alignment with my work as a student. Just for context, I'm also a doctoral student, currently working to get a DRPH in health management and policy. And one of the commitments that I made personally as I embark on this program is to remain grounded in equitable research. And then coincidentally, I have this partnership with Candace and team. But I am going to, once I get a little break, share a document that is really aligning with what we're talking about right now in terms of developing concrete steps for building partnership, which in turn sets the ground for quality and equitable research. So I'm going to paste that document. But for now, we can get into the specifics of what we at the center have been doing. So one of the things that are really important for us right now as a center is defining what peer work looks like. So our program has evolved. We have peers in a whole bunch of sectors of what we do, but the peer work is so amazing because they get it done, and the question becomes how, right? And usually we turn to literature as academics, if you're like me, or even leaders in general. You kind of turn to literature to kind of describe what peers do. My goal is to connect with our peer specialists that we have on board and define what their work looks like through their words. We kind of get a bird's eye view when we look at the literature or talk to people who are a bit disconnected from actually doing the work. And so I want to dive into the nuance because there's what I call jokingly like a sauce or an X factor that we tend to miss if we don't hear it directly from those who have embarked on engaging in that type of like really culturally sensitive and responsive work. So defining peer work through peer perspectives is one way we're embarking on that work. The second way is to develop that into a peer logic model. So understanding how we move from having the resources to do peer work to actually doing the work to our anticipated outcomes on short, intermediate, and long-term scales. So all of those are ways in which we are trying to incorporate our staff into how we talk about our program, how we think about how the program can evolve over time, how we do a self-assessment. And I say all that to say, we've talked a little bit about how I define community, and ultimately in embarking on this work, I define community not only as the communities that the Center and Healing Her People serve, but also in looking at the staff as community. I have read ample qualitative interviews from participants, and they really do mention the theme of staff, when they're doing their job, turning into family. That makes them community. They're trusted, they're reliable, they're supportive. And with that, not only because of their specializations and their training, but because they become family to our Philadelphia community, they too are the community that I want to make sure that I'm tapped into.
So I see George shaking his head. I had the pleasure of doing some work with Compass a while back, and so much of that I think is very true in how the staff and the connectivity between staff and those being served become so inextricably linked in a way that there's learning to be had on either side, and a real way to tell the story of the experience that those that you serve have, by also telling, and also telling the story of the staff as a part of that experience. So I really appreciate that perspective. I'm going to invite Claire on to join this conversation. I think it would be interesting to talk a little bit about the fact that this is not a overnight thing, right? Like, you don't wake up and say, we're going to do equitable evaluation, and then like, bam, it happens and everything is golden. As I mentioned earlier, I started my research career as an ethnographer and then went into to learn quantitative methods. And so it was a really interesting journey for me, because I started in this like values aligned way, and then moved into quant research. And I feel like it can be a little bit tricky when you start with those traditional structures, or you're handed those traditional structures as the way, and then you start moving into this different direction that's values aligned, mission aligned. And so I'm curious what types of changes and adjustments organizations have had to make. Your organization, George, Daria, Claire, organizations you've worked with, what have you seen in terms of the adjustments organizations have to make in order to approach the work in this way? I think I'm going to start. Oh, no. I'll start with you, Daria, since you were last the second time, and then roll through.
Absolutely. Organizationally, I think that we had to first commit. And that tends to be natural, especially when we're talking about like human services, especially if we're already rooted in like doing trauma-informed work, healing-centered work. But really, you have to explicitly commit to the process. I'll give a perfect example of one that's at least on the forefront of my mind now in our work. So we have a program, a violence prevention program that started a couple of years ago. And so it's been going great, right? And we've been getting callbacks from youth-focused organizations in which we've partnered and done like these youth groups, youth therapeutic groups with. And so it's been successful. And so the team started to talk about evaluation. And so we could have gone with a standard of just like forging forth with whatever tools we have. I remember somebody in the chat mentioning, going with like the easier route or going with more conventional tools. But this kind of, I got this drive to do this in a more participatory way, which took longer. Somebody else said that, and that is very true. But really, I worked with the team, which included our specialists, but also peers that engage with youth in these group-based sessions. And we have defined the priorities of the program, the pillars of the program, translating the pillars into measures, consolidating measures where needed to respect the time and the operations of the program. So it took longer, like I said, but we really produced a measure of what the program wanted to do, the impact that the program wanted to have. And that is a tool that we are currently using, but it required an organizational shift, both explicitly and in the way that we operate, to get to that point where the team feels like they have a tool that is measuring for quality assurance or leading into more comprehensive evaluations, which they have an interest in as well.
Thank you, Daria. Claire, curious what you've seen in your work partnering with and supporting organizations and making these kinds of shifts.
Knew you were going to invite me onto the panel conversation. It's good to join you all. So it's really interesting because I think for the longest time, both in my own like personal work when I was doing nonprofit work and also in the work that I do now with nonprofits, like people always saw their evaluation work as separate, right? It was like, this is our programmatic work and the work we do like mission-wise, and then this is our evaluation work over here. And it's like living in this other area, right? And I think what we're talking about shifting from traditional equitable evaluation practices. We're talking about breaking down that false dichotomy there and saying, how do we bring lessons from how we like do our programmatic work into how we do our evaluation work? And so that's how like we think about this, the work we do at Impact Ed. But I've also seen a lot of the organizations that we work with really think about, what are our values as an organization? How do we engage with the community that we serve in our programmatic work? And then how do we bring those same values to what we do in our evaluation work, right? And so I think of things like humility, right? What does humility look like in evaluation? We're talking about being okay with like things going wrong. You like the discomfort of like not knowing the answers or not being able to respond, right? So the value of humility. I also think of the value of courage, right? When I think about evaluation work and like bringing that into the space, like to challenge things, to try to do things differently, which I heard both Daria and George talking about in their responses. So I think, you know, Candace, kind of as I was reflecting on the conversation and also thinking about your question, like that's what comes to mind to me. Like, how do we not think about evaluation work as something different than programmatic work, but how do we think about those things in concert together?
Thank you, Claire. And you're really drawing on those two Ps, I mean, on the people purpose end of the approach and thinking about both your organizational why and mission, but what is the culture and the set of mindsets that you need to really deliver on this work? George, curious to hear from you. What shifts did your organization have to make to practice in this way?
Yeah, Claire, so the image that came to my head right before you were talking was really aligned, which is, if you've ever done like these evaluation stakeholder mapping exercises, you'll often have like, okay, here's our evaluation team, here's the skills that they have, here's our program team. And then the group that you actually did mention is like, here are the people that we're trying to serve as well. And all of these have expertise. And so traditionally you try to figure out each one, but really we wanna like mess all that up, because if we're doing evaluation right, if we're actually staffing our organization right, by having people with lived experience, by having people that have been served by similar or the same services literally in those, like these are not isolated buckets. And so we can't see them as just separate resources with separate expertise. They really have directly relevant things. And I would say part of that rich messiness is that it also introduces a challenge, which is, if we're going to treat evaluation like our program, it means that we need to be nimble and we need to be comfortable with not just delivering on the plan as it was laid out. And that is uncomfortable. Like I think it's uncomfortable for everybody. I'm sure there are some natural people who are just like, oh man, I just love it. But like, it can be really, really hard to say like, okay, we set out on this goal, and then we talked to folks and they told us we shouldn't do any of that. And so that takes real courage, to Claire's point, to say like, okay, we're on the wrong track here and we need to get back on track. And that means we're like taking, you know, these priorities away. So that's where I really see sort of this, you know, is that an evaluation choice, an evaluative choice? Is that a program decision? Is that your clients telling you what to do when you are in one of those inflection points? It's all three. And it's coming together and recognizing how, you know, the perspectives of those three have allowed you to make this choice to better serve your clients. But that is sort of where I see us making changes, is like, how do we truly recognize the alignment across these groups, where it's not really across the group. It's like we're one group of stakeholders, also to Daria's point about what we mean by a community that are engaged in this activity. Like yeah, I'll stop.
I love that. And I love that you brought it back to this concept of community, because I think there's this portion of defining the community and thinking about how you approach evaluation with community centricity around with an eye on all of the different pieces of community that exist. And I see Marquita's on the call. She's like right in my viewpoint. So, I mean, I have to say, because I know in working directly with Compass, how this community centricity is really from at every level within the organization. And I feel like I've seen how, you know, to George's point, shifts and change will happen because the clients have said, this is not what we need, or this, and I think it takes a lot of a real acknowledgement of the power and the expertise of the community, and not just just saying it, right? Like, it's not lip service, it is an action when we want to move in one direction as an organization and the community says this, and we commit to moving in that direction because it is what the community has asked for, and we, you know, and we don't take that take that lightly. And I think that's, you know, going back to Daria's point around committing to, I think that's a huge part of it. And then what does it mean to really support that mindset within the organization? I also will tell you, George, you got a lot of like 100% on your, what was that? Rich messiness. So if you learned nothing else today, you take nothing else away today, your new language you can use about this work is rich messiness. So we're running out of time a little bit on all the questions that I had. So I thought it might be helpful to do just one final whip around and ask for either, you know, words of wisdom or advice that you guys have. And if not advice, I would say maybe something you're wrestling with, which, you know, kind of allows for some set of maybe potentially giving some advice around what you've learned or what might be important for people to consider as they go on this journey, engaging all the rich messiness. And George, I'm going to start with you because I keep ending with you.
So to me, I think the place to start is always the folks you're serving. And so if this is something you're struggling with integrating, I think don't start by creating a new tool. Start by talking to the people you're trying to serve, and let that guide you to the tool that you need to make. And be comfortable that you might not get there in like in a time frame that you like could lay out in your annual goals, but that you're going to do something in the next, say, 2 weeks to learn about what your business experiences are in your programs or your blog is in your webinar, and take a next step on those on what you're learning from it in a short time, a couple of weeks.
Thank you, Daria.
Absolutely, I 100% agree. And I am also going to lift up some words that have resonated with me for a while that also came up in the chat. Co-learning and co-creating is where the basis of equitable work happens. So if you set those as your pillars, you're going to guide yourself in the direction that you aim to go. So really setting the intention around creating together. I'm going to take it a step further. I am currently in the process of really advocating for co-writing as well, because we all know literature, reports, etc. begets more literature, research, and reports. And so if we can get the perspectives of our communities and our staff members on paper, in presentations and conferences, that's going to inform that shift that we're trying to make as a collective here on the Zoom and beyond, around how practice or best practice should look, how best research practices should look. So I definitely endorse co-learning, co-creation, and collective writing.
Love it, love it. Claire, you got a bunch of hearts there, Daria.
Tough acts to follow. Candace, when you were talking a little bit about centering community just now, something that was coming to mind for me as a reflection and something I think I wrestle with, maybe something to leave with the group, is where does the power lie to make decisions, right? And I think that's really what we're talking about. When we're talking about equitable evaluation. The purpose of evaluation is to collect information and use that information to make decisions and choices about programs, right? And who has that power? And so I think that's a question that I think about a lot and I wrestle with a lot because I think it's a hard question and a complex question to answer. But I think that's what I'm sitting with and kind of I often reflect on in evaluation work. And then my piece of advice would be that this work can often feel daunting. What someone put in the chat before, it's like better but harder, right? So thinking about a way that you could start small within your organization. Maybe it's a particular program, maybe it's a particular question that you're trying to better understand, and like starting with something like that feels manageable and doable, and using that as an opportunity to learn about these different practices to then be able to grow and take those practices organization wide. So starting small and figuring out that what you can learn from that is a piece of advice I'd have.
Thank you, Claire. I just want to pull a thread on two things. The first is this concept of starting small. I run the community engagement module for the ECBI, and one of the things that we talk about is how often when we say community engagement, we think of it as this thing we run and go do, right? That there's not the same intensity around planning and being really intentional and a long-term view of what engagement looks like. And so I argue in that module that taking a step back and actually embedding your community engagement plan into how you think strategically about your organization's work overall is a way that we can actually enter community engagement work with intention, because it means we're taking the step back, asking the right questions. By right, I don't mean judgment. I just mean most appropriate questions to plan. Because often when we do things haphazardly, we can also cause harm. And so I do think the idea of a strategic approach that is really centered on taking a step back, making some decisions, starting small, and not trying to, you might not be able to start a community advisory board immediately, right? If there is harm that has been done in the community and repair to be done first, you start with that, right? You start by building relationships. I don't think he's on this call, but Carlos Aponte at We Love Philly talks about when he was first starting We Love Philly, he spent an entire year on a volunteer journey, just volunteering at other nonprofits because he felt like it was important to just understand the ecosystem where he was doing his work. And that was an investment in community engagement and partnership for the long term. And the last thing I'll say, also stealing from you, Claire, was just, the concept of asking questions and being grounded in and making sure you're centering and going back to values. I would say I've often encouraged organizations to have question protocols or things like that help them kick the tires on their practice. The concept of to whom are we giving power, or to whom are we taking power away, as a part of just ongoing practice as you're in design, as you are pulling together, whether it's your evaluation efforts or other efforts in your work, really allows you to think about your approach before you get into the weeds of activating and acting on. So Daria, George, really want to thank you. Claire, of course, thank you all for your words and commentary. It's been really great chatting with you. I'm going to pitch back to you, Claire, because I think we're going into some small groups.
We are. Thanks, Candace. And thanks again to Daria and George. So we know from just the great comments and feedback that's been coming in the chat that there is also a lot of expertise in this group here right now. And so we wanted to give you all an opportunity in some smaller groups to process and share some of what you're learning. So we're going to go, you're going to get one of us with you in one of the breakout groups shortly. But I'm going to share with you what we're going to do when we get into those breakout groups. And if I could invite and Jocelyn from our team can put the Jamboard in the chat. So it wouldn't be a good session if we didn't have good Jamboard interactive activity here. So some of you may be familiar with the Rosebud Thorn reflection activity. If you're not, it's pretty simple, straightforward. The rose is something that's working for you. So when you get into your breakout groups, we're curious if you have tried to practice an equitable evaluation or engaging community in your evaluation work that's been successful. What's that looked like? Let's share those ideas with each other. what is the thorn on the other end here of this, reflection sheet, like something that has been a challenge, either that you're currently experiencing or that you anticipate, like this work is hard. There are barriers to doing it effectively. So what are some of the thorns? And then the bud in the middle is if there's a practice that you're considering trying, maybe it's something that you've been workshopping or thinking about in your organization, or something that came up for you today, like you heard George or Daria share an experience and you want to try and think about what that could look like in your group. So anything that's on your mind. So we're going to give you the next 15 minutes in some smaller groups. You'll have one of us in there with you to help facilitate, to share some practices with each other about equitable evaluation. And then we're really excited. You'll have access to this Jamboard moving forward to source some of the ideas and the collective wisdom and expertise of this group. So any questions on what we are going to ask you to do when you get into breakout groups before we get there? All right, I'm going to ask Alex to open them up then, and we'll give you the next 15 minutes. So just 3:16 will come back. All right.
Claire, I would just like to say we started the revolution in my room. I don't know what happened with everyone else. But.
What? Oh, well, great. You're going to be the first person to share back then, Candace, group 1.
I'm just joking.
I love it. In 15-minute breakout Zoom group. That's amazing. Do we have everybody back? I know I came back a little bit before the countdown. We're all back. All right. Well, we didn't start a revolution in my breakout group, but we did generate a lot of ideas in a quick amount of time. Ideas that are roses and some that are thorns, because this work is hard, as we've noted. So you all should have access to the Jamboard, and we wanted to take just a few minutes to close out by giving you a chance to kind of look through, right, what other groups talked about. Maybe you'll see something similar to what your group talked about. Now we're all furiously going to the first tab, which is Candace's group, to read about the revolution on the sticky notes. But take a minute to kind of skim through that. And while we do that, if people want to come off mute, kind of popcorn in, if you want to raise your hand, I can find you that way too. Thank you, James. Please feel free to use the raise hand function. Would love to hear any insights of what's coming up for you. Maybe there's a practice that you see represented that you want to try or that really resonates with you. Maybe there's a challenge or a question that you're really wrestling with. You can click across right here at the top and you can see all the reflections from the group. So someone from this first group want to share what revolution you started? Any insights that came up for you all?
Yeah, yeah, sure. I shared that organization made a decision about a decade ago, was to really invest in internal evaluation specifically, and they created a learning and evaluation department, and that's what I'm part of. And so our learning and evaluation department really focuses a lot on the programmatic, like the learning cycle and like iterative learning with our programs, and we build deep relationships with them. And we have focused externally on like using external evaluators for things that require, like, government contracts and things like that. So it frees us up to focus on more specifically really the learning process in our org, and it gives us a little room to be more creative with what we do.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing. What else stands out for people from looking through the Jamboard or your group? Any insight you're left with, question, concrete practice? I invite some of the other facilitators too to chime in if anything was stood out for you all from your groups. I see, George, that adding rich messiness to the vocabulary around equitable evaluation has emerged. So that's going to be a new coined phrase for sure.
Yes, I have the honor to speak on behalf of my group. I think there were so many things that were lifted in conversation. I really do not think that we captured it all here, but one of the key things that we were talking about as we transitioned back to the big group was elevating and advocating for those outcomes that are priorities for the organization versus the funder. And then getting that board backing or their funder backing behind those outcomes that have meaning not only to our organizations, but to our communities. Because again, in the spirit of like logic models, that's what's leading to the public health outcomes that we see. So really defining the intermediary outcomes, the primary outcomes, et cetera, based off of the needs and priorities of our communities. That's the key word for me, I guess, today.
Love that. Appreciate you sharing, Daria. And I do think we talked about like what matters most, right, to the communities you're serving, and how do you push, right? Because this isn't easy work, and how do you push back, and how do you advocate for lifting up those perspectives as well. So one final thing we wanted to share with you all before we pitch it back over to Uva, and we will share this out as well as a follow-up is, go to the right screen. Of course, now I stopped sharing my screen and I started. Are you all looking now at a word cloud? I think you probably see it on my screen.
Yes.
Create a word cloud from the words that you all shared at the beginning of what equitable evaluation looks like as opposed to what traditional evaluation looks like. And I just wanted to leave you with that and give you kind of a moment to circle back to where we started. These were the words that you all were lifting up at the beginning, impersonal, exploitative, academic, clinical, quantitative, right? And these are the words that we're talking about when we talk about a shift to equitable practices: trust, listening, co-learning, being flexible, ongoing growth, right? So I think like these words like really hopefully capture what we dug into today. And it was a quick conversation, but when we started, we said we hoped that we left you feeling inspired about thinking about evaluation work in a different way within your organizations. And so hopefully these words kind of help center the kind of evaluation that we want to be in place moving forward. So thank you all. The time flew by. Super great engagement, lots of expertise here in the room. One thing, Uva, I shared with my group, which I'll share with folks here, we did share a resource, a handout that went along with this, but folks were asking if we had additional resources beyond what was in the handout. And I said, we absolutely do. So we are happy to link some additional like resources, tools that we have found effective for folks that have participated to have following. So we'll definitely send that as a follow-up. And thank you again, and I'll pitch it back over to Uva.
Thank you so much, Claire. And always, we run out of time whenever great things are happening. But we really do appreciate this conversation, these sharings. I, on my end, am chewing on a few things. I'm sure all of you are as well. Things like asking ourselves, where does the power lie in decision-making and co-learning, co-creating, and co-writing as the basis of equitable work? Rich messiness is a vibe, everyone. George, thank you for creating it. The importance of cultural sensitivity and context, community centricity, and a reminder not to create a new tool, but to start by listening to those we serve. So many gems. I want to thank all of our speakers, Claire, Candace, Daria, Jocelyn, and George, the Spring Point Partners team and Witty Gritty, our production team, and especially all of you who took some time to participate today. We don't take it lightly that you built time for this. A few Spring Point Partners reminders, because I think this content was beautiful and heavy, and we will absolutely do a follow-up email with these materials so you have them available. I would strongly encourage you to reach out to Claire. We'll have contact information for everyone on this panel so that if you want to engage more directly, you can. I encourage you to. Our Spring Point Partners Central Learning Series pauses for the summer. We resume again in September, but we at Spring Point are still hosting a number of other events, some in person, some webinars between now and September. And so you are invited to join us as content and topics may be relevant to your interest in the work you do. First, we're having an in-person book launch of The Guarantee by Natalie Foster. That will be part of our economic justice portfolio. If you want to join us to talk about guaranteed income with leading voices and practitioners, join us on June 13th. The link will be or is currently in the chat. On July 11th, Life of Riley, one of our other priority areas, is hosting a webinar, Breeding Dogs for Profit in Urban Communities, Causes and Solutions. It will be an exceptional conversation. We are also, of course, continuing with our podcast. It's called Our Wellspring, Our latest episode dropped just last week with an incredible conversation with Youth Build Executive Director Leandro Dunn, who shares his origin story and just talks about his work leading, supporting, and co-building community with the remarkable youth his team serves. Finally, we are releasing our full fall programming in September, but for now, if you can, please hold December 11th for a fireside chat with a guest that I am really, when you meet people or you know about people, you read about people, you listen to people who are just incredible and stir your soul. I can't say the name just yet, but I promise you, time in this particular fireside will be time well spent. So hold your calendars. If you are local, there'll be an opportunity for you to join us here on December 11th. If you are somewhere else in the country or in the world, you can join us remotely as well. So December 11th, more to come on that. Suffice it to say that after an interesting presidential cycle, I think it will be wonderful to engage and kind of close out the year with human-centered grounding, with love, and maybe a little bit of poetry along the way. We are thrilled that so many of you joined us for this important discussion about measurement and about evaluation. These are critical components to the work that many of us do, and I think we all know they deserve interrogation. Relatedly, here at Spring Point Partners, when I think about measurement, I also think about the importance of how we approach this work. I think the how matters. Simran, if many of you know her, our EVP of Impact, always reminds us as we approach measurement, we should remember it can be a fragile thing that can break the very thing we are trying to do if not handled with care. I hope that as all of you continue to approach measurement, you do so with values, alignment, and equity, all of the things that our incredible speakers reminded us of. The how matters. With that, thank you so much. We are exactly at time. We're so appreciative of you being with us today. Have a wonderful summer ahead. We'll see you soon. Thanks, everyone.